hallucinations, hoaxes, all these different other possibilities, they suddenly become really, really complicated. The explanation becomes complicated. Jesus rose from the dead and people responded to that by worshiping him, by following him to the point of death. That suddenly becomes a much simpler one when we take the whole of the evidence into account.
Today, I'm speaking with Timothy Paul Jones, Vice President for Doctoral Studies, Professor of Christian Family Ministry, and Chair of the Department of Apologetics, Ethics, and Philosophy at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. His new book is Did the Resurrection Really Happen? From Crossway. Timothy, thanks so much for joining me today on the Crossway podcast.
It's great to be with you.
So today I want to pose a number of questions or objections even that skeptics, people who aren't Christians, might have related to the resurrection, this core doctrine of our faith, something that, as Paul says, our faith would fall apart if it weren't for the resurrection. And I think it could be helpful not just for those who are having apologetic conversations with unbelievers, as many of us are, trying to explain and answer objections that they might have, but I wonder if there might even be some Christians listening who, if they're honest with themselves, they might hear some of these objections and think, I don't actually know what I think about that. I don't know how I would answer that. That actually makes me a little bit nervous sometimes when it comes to the resurrection. And so I wonder if we can play act this a little bit. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
So first question for you would be, isn't it possible that the resurrection accounts that we read in the Bible were just legends or myths that Jesus' followers developed after his death, and that they actually are pretty similar to some of the other myths of the ancient world where there was this dying and rising again kind of God? So I think of the myth of Osiris or Attis. Is the story of Jesus really any different from these other stories that all Christians would say is, oh, that's not true, that's just a myth?
Well, that's an important question to raise. And in fact, that's something I actually really wrestled with when I was in college. I really went through a hard crisis of faith. And that was one of the things that to me was the hardest thing to get over. It really was. I really struggled with that. But here's what I found is that anytime you have a legend that is something pre-existing, some sort of an idea that's pre-existing in this, that you've got to recognize and to compare the resurrection with this and recognize, oh my goodness, there's far more different than there is similar. So let's think about that whole dying, rising God type of thing that happens right there.
Because there is precedent for that.
Oh, yes, there are. There's certainly precedents for this dying, rising God. It's a real thing out there. You can find this pattern in particular places in certain cultures previous to the time of Jesus. But here's one of the key things that's different. Those are always agricultural kind of dying and rising. It's something that happens on a yearly basis.
Oh, the same God is dying repeatedly.
And rising again, over and over and over. So there's this tie to the seasons, a tie to the agricultural cycle, and a repetitive nature of it. The other thing that you never see is a physical resurrection in those. It's always a metaphorical or at most a spiritual resurrection. So that's why, for example, it's so crucial when you have in the New Testament Gospels, Jesus is described in starkly physical terms. Yes, he has a spiritual body that can pass through walls, all of that, but it is also a physical body. He eats fish, he cooks fish, he's at the beach there calling his disciples out in the boat. All these things are happening. It is a distinctly physical, and it is recognized that it is once and for all. And when you look at that, there ends up being more distinction between Jesus and these dying, rising gods than there is similarity. But I would also add this. I'm actually not against somebody seeing a connection between these, because the truth is that I think all of these dying and rising God myths, what we see in those is that they are a precedent for this in the sense that we all know we need new life, resurrection. We know we need a Savior who does this. And so the pagans do this in the best way they know how, by tying it to the seasons. They do it the best way they know how, by tying it to their fields and their fertility and all of those things like that. They do it the best way they know how. But what we have in appearance in the pagans, we have in its essence, in its truth, in its reality in Jesus. And so all that they're doing with their dying, rising gods, that yes, there was a precedent for that. It's fulfilled physically once for all in Jesus. It's different, distinctly different, and yet I will also acknowledge the similarity and say that the similarity actually builds up a case for the truthfulness of the resurrection.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting your comment about the way it's tied to the seasons, tied to the kind of cyclical nature of plants, of crops that we're used to. And I've heard other people even mention that even that, the dynamic with plants and the foundational importance of these seasons for an agricultural culture like ancient Israel, even in of itself, the way that God designed the world to function naturally, it foreshadows in a sense the central importance of death and resurrection.
Yes, you see that especially in Augustine. Augustine sees this really clearly. I can think of a sermon he preached in the winter of 411, and Augustine hated winter. He hated it with a passion. And
So
and I love Augustine.
all the people in the northern United States can go
Yes,
read some Augustine if they feel sad.
exactly, exactly. So he hated winter, but he was talking about in this sermon it was in the winter moving towards spring of 411. He was talking about how awful winter was and these things like this. But here's what he does in that sermon that is so fascinating as he's approaching Easter at this time. He talks about how God created the world in the beginning with the resurrection, the death and resurrection already in mind. You
Mm,
see, sometimes we think that Jesus died and was resurrected, and oh, isn't this as a sweet analogy that we have spring and we have winter and spring? That, well, it makes a nice analogy. Augustine's like, no, 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 no.
mm,
God created the world in the beginning with seasons because he already had Jesus in mind.
yeah.
So he says creation itself testifies to the resurrection
Mm.
because God created the world already thinking about the death and the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that's just beautiful.
And God has embedded these patterns that are kind of hints of what's to come in Jesus. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So another question: given the gospel accounts were written decades after Jesus' death and supposed resurrection, how can we trust that those were accurately reporting historical events? Sometimes we might be surprised to learn. I know that was my example. I know that was my situation where I didn't realize until maybe college that these gospel accounts were written literally decades after the events that they describe. I thought they were, happening, being recorded by disciples in real time. And that was a little bit shaking to me. It was a little bit like, wow, if I asked somebody to tell me about something that happened 30 years ago or more, I might not feel as confident in their recollection.
I think that's an important thing, and it's one of the pushbacks you get from people like Bart Ehrman and people like that are often skeptical about the truthfulness of the New Testament Gospels. And I want to say first that this notion that something is not reliable after decades is something that is distinct and unique to our own what we have post the creation of the printing press in the
Mm,
15th century. So after the printing press, we are from that time to now, we are getting things from spoken reality to print far more quickly. It's
yeah.
just gotten quicker and quicker ever since the mid 15th century with the invention of the printing press to now. It has gotten quicker and quicker and quicker
Yeah.
from spoken to printed. And just for us to recognize that wasn't the case for most of human history. Just first off, to recognize that a span, which we do have in the Gospels, of 3 to 6 decades of after the events actually happened, that's actually not that different from histories of the Caesars or anything like that. So first off, we should recognize that some of our hesitance to accept that is grounded in our own historical situatedness and where we are in history.
Mm,
For the people in the first, second, third, fourth century and later, that would not have seemed nearly as atypical as it does for us, who, if something miraculous were to happen in this room right now, it would be on social media within a few hours.
right.
And so it's important for us to recognize that. But even with that stated, it is true that there is a gap. And that gap should at least concern us, or at least we should have an answer for that particular gap.
Mm,
But I want to point out a few things that actually support the truthfulness of the New Testament Gospels over that time. Here's one really important thing to think about. It's that the New Testament Gospels that what's in them never becomes oral tradition. I want to make a distinction right here that's pretty important in sociology and in sociological analyses of narratives, that oral histories is what you get when the eyewitnesses are still alive. Oral traditions are what you get when the eyewitnesses die out.
Mm.
Here's the thing with the Gospels. They're all written down while eyewitnesses are still alive.
Yeah.
But not only that, the eyewitnesses are actually circulating in the churches. We get that just from offhand comments of Paul, who speaks about Peter, who says Peter and his wife, they're traveling around, and some of the other apostles are traveling around in the churches. There's this clear notion that the apostles are traveling around. People who were the eyewitnesses were traveling around. Well, what happens in that is that the very people who actually originated some of these stories, the people who are eyewitnesses, they're showing up in the churches where the stories are being told. That means the story can't get too far from the original reality. So one of the analogies that is sometimes used, in some ways it's a very poor analogy, but an analogy that is sometimes used is the telephone game.
Yeah.
That you have somebody tell somebody a story, and then that person tells the next person, one by one, all the way around a circle, secretly, each one, and they go all the way around the circle. Then by the end, it's garbled, and everybody laughs and says, oh, haha, this is what the original story was in that. Now, when I was in elementary school, I hated that game, would always sabotage that game partway through.
There's always someone in there who who wants to throw in a little bit of a curve.
I was that kid. That was me. That was me every single time on that. But one of the things I want to say when somebody uses that is, okay, I will actually grant you that. I will grant you the telephone game. And here's what I mean by that. The reason the telephone game works is precisely because the person who started the story in the beginning is still there at the end. It works for that reason.
So you can confirm or deny.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The person who started the story is still there. And so because they're still there, they can say, okay, this was the original story that was told in the exact same way. In the early church, when the Gospels were being written, that during that time, the people who were eyewitnesses were still present and circulating. And so the truth could be checked against that. I think it's one other little thing to add to that, and that is in terms of the resurrection in particular. The resurrection story, it does not emerge 30 years later. That's important for us to recognize. There's a distinction between, yes, the New Testament Gospels as biographies, as a bios genre of literature that emerges describing Jesus. Yes, that emerges 30 to 60 years after the resurrection. But it's very clear that we have an established tradition about the resurrection, which Paul records in some level in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in that summary of the resurrection, verses 3 through 7 of 1 Corinthians 15. That is in circulation very early. Paul says that he received it, and if we look at the most likely times and places for him to have received it, it is within just a few years of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And if all that we had, I was to think about it this way, if all that we had was just 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, if that's all we had, do you realize we actually have all we need to be confident that Jesus is somebody we ought to trust? Because it says that he died, he was buried. It's very clear, ataphe right there, that he was buried. He was buried and he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. It's an affirmation of the Old Testament. It says he died on our behalf. He died for us. Huper. There's substitutionary atonement right there. And it was done according to the scriptures, affirmation of the Old Testament. He was buried. He was raised on the third day. We have everything that we need to say we ought to trust Jesus.
Yeah, the outline is right there in that one phrase.
It's all there. To praise God, we have more than that.
Yeah.
But if we had only that, and if only that were true, there's still every reason to trust, to believe, to follow Jesus.
So a related question or concern to this whole topic of kind of trusting what was written down decades afterwards is just the issue of eyewitnesses. Oftentimes, Christians will point to the fact that there were eyewitnesses. People saw Jesus after his resurrection. He appeared to all these people as recorded in the Gospels. And yet we also have, kind of in our modern day, we recognize the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. And we've actually tried to mitigate against that in our court system and how we think about eyewitness testimony and how we pressure test it and allow it to be cross-examined, and how we require multiple eyewitnesses at times to confirm something as true. How do you respond to that? That, there could have been all kinds of reasons why people might have genuinely thought they saw Jesus, they encountered Jesus after the fact, but maybe they were just confused.
It's an important point for us to raise. It really is. And it's one that we should take seriously because it is true that eyewitness testimony is not 100% reliable. Let's acknowledge that. We know that.
Yeah.
If you have children, you know that your children can tell you vastly different stories about the same thing. And sometimes some of them are lying, sometimes some of them are incorrect, but they can tell you
Yeah.
vastly different
I
stories.
mean,
We
I
know that.
I read this article about 9/11, about a decade after the September 11th attacks in the U.S., and they interviewed people right after the attacks, and they interviewed them 10 years later, and they documented all of these examples of a number of people, many of the people, contradicting themselves, what they had said they saw right after the attacks versus what they remembered seeing 10 years later. And so it kind of just raises that
Mhm.
specter of how can we even know people might not even intentionally be misleading people.
And I think when we get to the resurrection, here's the first and most important thing about this, especially to do with the resurrection, that people forget details and they forget and they get mixed up on a
Yeah.
whole lot of details, but they will remember certain key moments and events. So in the first part of this, we're talking about just the resurrection of Jesus. We're not here to talking about the teachings of Jesus and some things like that yet, but we're just talking about the resurrection. That's the type of thing that is sometimes people talk of a gist memory, that there's certain things that people they may not say it the exact same way, but they remember certain particular events
Mm.
that they all agree on. And we could think, let's think of the analogy of 9/11. They may get a lot of things incorrect, perhaps even the order in which the planes tragically struck the buildings. Maybe some things they could even get things
Yeah.
like that wrong.
Right.
But that fundamental, most important central memory that these planes struck these buildings and these buildings collapsed as a basis, as a result of that, that is something that is that they're
Everyone agrees
remembering.
on. Yeah.
Everyone agrees on that. So
Mm.
if we can think about the resurrection, that's that big event
Yeah.
that everybody agreed on. Resurrection on the third day. Every single one of these accounts agrees on that. But
Mm.
not only that, there's just as a side note, there's also other things that they all agree on, that every single one of them agree on. Mary Magdalene, all except for 1 Corinthians chapter 15, every account gives Mary Magdalene as the first witness at the empty tomb. There's certain other things that are held in common by every single one of the witnesses. And so once again, even if that's all we had, now praise God, we have more than that, and I believe in far more than that. I'm not saying that that's all we should believe, but if that was all that's true, if all that's true is resurrection on the third day, Mary Magdalene is first witness, Jesus actually died, he was buried, he was raised, and Mary Magdalene saw him alive, and then he appeared to multiple people afterwards. If that's all we had, that is enough to trust that Jesus was somebody we trust and follow.
Mm.
And that's what's important for us to recognize. Now, we can move a little bit into just for a moment. I know that's not the main topic we're talking about, but I do also believe that in terms of the rest of the Gospels, that we also have the fact that there were multiple people that were, we could say, checking this. And I don't mean literally checking over what was written and everything like that, but as these stories are told and passed on, they are stories which there were people who were eyewitnesses who were correcting, redirecting memories.
Mm.
And one other thing we should add in this is the notion of an exact word for word quotation is a very modern idea. They just didn't think in those terms. They did not think in terms of an exact word for word quotation.
That wasn't that
It
important to
was, it
them.
wasn't, yes, it just simply wasn't the way they thought of things in that time period. What was important in writing a biography, what was important in writing a text that is historically accurate, is something that is accurate to the intent of the speaker. And we even find that in some of the historiographical works in the first, second, third century, that's how they're thinking in
Mm.
terms of. And so in some ways, we could be, it's much like the whole thing to do with things going quickly to press, being written down quickly. Sometimes it's easy to read our modern cultural biases back into that time
Mm.
period and have an expectation that they themselves didn't have about exactitude in terms of reporting
Yeah,
things.
but we see that in like even the chronology of the Gospels, where there are certain events that are placed in different places, and part of that is just difference in kind of what it meant to do history back then compared to today.
Exactly. So they would put things in an order to fulfill a particular goal that they had for what they wanted to communicate. And this is accurate. It's truthful. That Matthew is trying to communicate something somewhat different about Jesus than Luke. Those two things are not in contradiction.
Mm.
But Luke is arranging his narrative to make a set of points that are somewhat different than what Matthew is doing. Not in contradiction. There's no contradiction between them, but that they're doing different things, and that's okay. And the same thing with Mark and with John. They're each doing something somewhat different. It's why it's beautiful and important that God, by his Spirit, has inspired 4
Yeah.
Gospels, because we get this full orbed picture of who Jesus actually was.
Mm. So some skeptics today, and certainly even skeptics, the Jewish leaders of Jesus' own day after his death and resurrection, they'll suggest that Jesus' disciples stole his body. Someone stole his body, and that kind of became the foundation for this resurrection myth that then spread around. Where again, undoubtedly, many of Jesus' followers sincerely believed that he had raised from the dead because his body was gone, but actually it was just stolen by some of his followers. How would you respond to that? How can we know that that isn't actually what happened?
I think there are 2 different things that we can say in response to that that are helpful and that are accurate to the history. One of those is that Christianity clearly becomes a problem for the religious leadership in Jerusalem very quickly.
Mm.
If the disciples had stolen the body, or if somebody else had stolen the body, I think I'd have been looking for that body and seeing if I
Yeah,
could locate
you're
that
trying to
body.
find it and then
Yes,
say, "Yeah, nope, he's right here."
because that would squelch the whole thing immediately. And so I think that's not so much something that we're drawing particular historical data. We're simply saying, look, this is something that seems like they would have tried to do.
Mm.
And hiding a body, where there's a lot of things of getting a body out, of hiding it without anybody seeing it, all those things like that.
I
It's
mean,
it's a little absurd when you
and
think
that's
about
and
that.
that's why they posted guards, right? I mean,
Exactly.
they understood from the get-go that this was a potential threat to
Yes.
what they had done, and so they were trying to mitigate against it.
Exactly. And the second thing that I think is important for us to recognize, and this one is far more important, and is one that we aren't simply making an observation about typical human behavior. We actually have evidence for this one, actual historical evidences. And it's simply the fact that if the disciples had stolen the body, so on the other hand, if we say if somebody else had stolen the body, they're going to find that body. But if the disciples had stolen the body, which seems more likely that the disciples might have done that, you have at least 3 disciples who died for the faith that they were professing in the risen Lord Jesus. Now,
Mm.
there were probably more than that, but I'm talking about the ones that we have such strong historical evidence for that it's undoubtable.
Yeah.
Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and James, the apostle. Those 3, all 3 died for their faith in the risen Jesus. And as I said, this is not just evidence inside the New Testament, this is evidence outside the New Testament, and indeed some evidence from people who weren't even Christians. We
Mm.
have evidence for this. So for those 3, there is no reasonable way to deny that they died for their faith in Jesus Christ. And here's the thing. At least one of them, probably all of them, if the disciples stole the body,
Yeah.
they're
They
they're
were in
close
on
to
it.
they were in on it. And you've got people dying for something that they knew was a hoax, and something for which they weren't getting anything positive out of it. It's
Mm.
not like by creating this new religion they were getting some sort of wealth or power or
Yeah.
anything else. They're gaining nothing through this new religion. They're losing everything. They go all the way to death, testifying. We know that they go to death from other sources outside the New Testament, and yet they don't back down from it. They
Mm.
don't back down. They go all the way to the point of death. People will die for lies in history. Millions of people have died for lies, but people don't die for what they know is a lie. And people don't, even if maybe somebody would, you don't have 3 people
Mm.
all dying for something they know was a lie. So if they went to that point, they truly believed Jesus was resurrected. They truly believed it. Now, whether they were right, whether they were wrong, obviously I believe the evidence points to them being right. But whatever it was, they really did believe it.
Yeah, because that was another question I had is, you look at sometimes Christians will argue, well, because these people were willing to die and suffer for the sake of this Messiah that they believed in, that kind of demonstrates that it must have been true. But again, we look at history, we look at the world today even, and we see there are a lot of people who are willing to give their lives, sacrifice their lives for something that we as Christians would say is complete falsehood. And so, again, how do you respond to that idea that simply the fact that they were willing to give their lives demonstrates that it was true?
I think it's important for us as Christians to respond to that in a much more limited sense than we sometimes do. Martyrdom itself doesn't demonstrate truth. Just martyrdom alone does not demonstrate truth. It's martyrdom of somebody who would have known whether or not it was true or false.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about here. And I think it's important for us to limit our argument to that, because otherwise we become rightly susceptible to somebody saying, look, this person died for this person died for this. Does that mean all those? No, it doesn't mean all those things are true. But those people sincerely believed it was true. And so we bring two things together: people who would have known if it was true, and people who died for it being true, who believed it was true and would have known differently. That's what we have to look for at that point, at those two things intersect. And Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and James the apostle, for those three, it intersects. We have good evidence that they died for their faith. We also have good evidence they would have known if it was false. And so that intersection is that point at which we should build our argument.
Yeah. Maybe as a final question. So in philosophy, there's this notion of Occam's razor, right? The idea that essentially says the simplest explanation is usually the best one, usually the right one. We start there, and we see that demonstrated, the validity of that general principle in how we think about the world all over the place. So when it comes to the resurrection, isn't the simplest explanation the one that requires the least jumping through hoops to say that something else happened to Jesus rather than this kind of supernatural, miraculous resurrection, something we've not ever witnessed with our eyes before, we don't see in everyday life, but we do see conspiracies, we see people lying, we see people getting confused. Isn't the simplest explanation one of those other theories rather than actual resurrection?
Well, I think there's two levels at how we should engage with that particular question. One of them is it's important for us to admit, both as Christians or non-Christians, whoever we are, that the explanation that seems simplest is going to be driven, at least in part, by the presuppositions we bring to that. And so if you presuppose a universe in which there is no spiritual reality, yeah, that's going to be the easiest and the simplest explanation, is that it just didn't happen.
Yep.
If you
by definition can't
By
happen.
definition, exactly, it can't happen. If you're going to presuppose the possibility of both, of either that it could have been a materialist explanation or a spiritual one, or some confluence of both, then I would contend that the simplest explanation is that Jesus was raised from the dead. And I say that because if you think about it, it's not just, you don't simply have to explain there was no body in the tomb. You have to explain a lot of other things too. What happened to the body? You have to explain why people would start giving their lives and risking their lives in response to this. Why people would continue to hold on to this truth even despite the fact that they were being persecuted when there were people who would have seen it. You have to start explaining other things. And so when we apply the law of Occam's razor, which I think it's a good thing for us to do, we have to recognize we don't just have to explain the initial event. We also have to explain the things that came after the event. When you begin to look at it that way, the explanations that involve hallucinations, hoaxes, all these different other possibilities, they suddenly become really, really complicated. The explanation becomes complicated. The other one, Jesus rose from the dead and people responded to that by worshiping him, by following him to the point of death, that suddenly becomes a much simpler one when we take the whole of the evidence into account, not just the initial event itself of somebody being raised from the dead or body being gone from the tomb, not just that, but if we take the whole thing of that and recognize we also have to have an explanation that accounts for what happened in the months and years after that, then suddenly the Christian explanation actually does become a much simpler explanation.
Yeah. You started off that answer by referencing just the presuppositions that we bring, all of us bring to any question, any issue that we're thinking about. How do you help someone who is coming from a materialist kind of worldview where they just almost categorically think, well, there's just these things can't happen. Miracles don't happen. And I've never seen one happen. I've never known anyone who said they saw one happen. So that it's just like, it's the same reason why I don't think that one of the explanations is aliens came and got his body and took him away and they were invisible. And there's things that are kind of so far beyond our normal experience that we don't even entertain them as possibilities. How do you help somebody who is in that spot to actually become open to the possibility of, let's just say, the supernatural in the world?
I think one of the things I want first for them to see is that they are being the ones at that point who is closed-minded. Often Christians are the closed-minded, bigoted people in terms of people's perceptions. The fact is we're being more open-minded because we have a multiplicity of different potential explanations for this. We presuppose that. The other thing I really want to do just at a more gentle, loving, working down to the core of their issues is I'm actually somebody like that. I'm going to ask them, when did you start feeling this way? When did you start having this doubt about the spiritual realm? Because something I found over and over is actually that the person who is doing that, usually there's some point of doubt or hurt that we have to get down to with them. And so I'm actually not going to start by flinging evidence at them. I don't think it's helpful at that point. I'm going to ask them, when did you start feeling this way?
Yeah, what's the story there?
What's the story of how you got here? Because I just have deep confidence in Romans chapter 1, where Paul says that everybody knows that there is a God. And if they came to a point at which they fundamentally just disbelieve in the spiritual completely, something has happened to lead them away from what their heart knows, to draw them away from that. And I want them to tell me that story. And I want to talk about that story. And then I want to move toward evidence. But long before I get to the evidence, I want to find out what got you here and how can I speak with love and with grace into what got you there. How can I care for you in what may be a point of deep pain in your life? How can I care for you and love you in that? And that's actually the first thing I'm going to do before I ever get to the evidence.
Timothy, that's such a helpful way to even finish up this conversation. We've been so focused on evidence and arguments, but we can sometimes, as we do apologetics, we can lose sight of the fact that we're talking to a person who has a history, has feelings, has fears, and oftentimes the beginning of apologetics, even the end of apologetics, is engaging with the person and right in front of us and listening to them. So thank you so much for taking the time today to help us have a little more understanding of how we can engage with people on this topic.
Thank you. It's been great to be with you.
That was Timothy Paul Jones on the evidence for the resurrection. For more, be sure to check out his book, Did the Resurrection Really Happen? From Crossway. Pick up a print copy of the book for 30% off, or get the ebook or audiobook for 50% off directly from Crossway by visiting crossway.org/plus. And if you like this interview, check out another conversation I had with William Lane Craig entitled How to Respond to Common Arguments Against Christianity. To listen, click the link in the show notes or search for the episode wherever you get your podcasts. For more audio content like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend and leaving us a review. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.